next speaker is Kaitlyn Rebmann, and she has been with the FASD network since November 2023. So she's our RAP 2 FASD Instructional Coach. So her area is the entire South. So she not only has the Southeast Alberta network, which is our network, she also has the Lethbridge and the South network as well. Because myself and the coordinator from that area decided we would share her so we could put more money together and we could get a really great trainer, and but she just has a very large area to do. So she has, like I said, this whole network, and then she's got the South as well. So when she comes up, she can more explain sort of her entire area and how far-reaching she is. Her goal, or her role, is to go into the schools and help the teachers with strategies, FASD strategies, so that the students can be more successful in the classrooms. So she connects with all the schools. She's now connecting to the online schools and even some of the homeschooling situations as well. So I'll have Kaitlyn come up and she can explain a little bit more about what her role is, what she does, where she goes to for her trainings, and then do her presentation. Thanks, Kaitlyn.
Hello. Oh, good. Okay. I can tell you can hear me. Thank you, Myrna. Yes, so I am the RAP 2.0 Instructional Coach. I travel, as Myrna said, all the way from, I'm trying to visualize it this way for you guys. So essentially the Crow's Nest Pass and all the way up onto the other side to Oyen. So I've been in this position since November, and I don't think I've ever seen so much of my own province, and I've only really seen the South, but a lot of back roads. It's been interesting. Keep it, switch it up, but maybe not in the wintertime, because that's, if you ever need to practice regulation, take a back road in the wintertime. It's fun. I made it. It was good. It was okay. So yeah, my role is to connect with educators and provide small group training, large group training, professional development, all on FASD and how to support individuals affected with FASD. So I most recently, as Myrna said, I connected with a caregiver who has decided to do the online school option, and that was a really, really interesting conversation as to how she could kind of separate the two, the home life, the school, and what strategies would work for the school setting at home, because that's quite a unique situation to be in, right? So, but very interesting for sure. Okay. So my name is Kaitlyn. Yes, I have that written down on this paper. I like to share. I am a caregiver, not of children with FASD, but with autism, intermittent explosive disorder, ADHD combined type. It's a really fun household. There's a lot going on. And so I talk a little bit, a couple slides after this, about the comorbidities that come with FASD, and ADHD is one of those that does happen quite often. So I like to take a lot of my personal experience as well as professional experience and help it or use it to guide my practice that I share with teachers and educators, and come with that caregiving perspective as well. I find is very helpful. So the goal for this presentation is to, as the name suggests, adjust or shift our expectations when working with individuals with FASD. So I'm going to share some foundational information on FASD, share information that we can relate to, hopefully make you laugh a little bit, because if you're laughing, you're learning typically, and reframe some of the common challenges that might present with FASD. So I like to also start whenever I do a presentation, whether it's big, small, I like to kind of share the rules for the presentation. Essentially, when it comes to, as I'm talking, you do what you need to do to be comfortable. If you need to stand, as long as you're not in the way of anybody else, please stand. If you need to excuse yourself, please do so, get a drink, however. as I said, my house is very neurodivergent. I also have ADHD, so you might distract me, and that's okay. I know how to work with that. I just make sure you're comfortable as well. So, no, we don't want to move forward. Hang tight. Yay. Okay. So I recently attended a webinar with Jackie Pye and her colleagues, and I really wanted to add this into the presentation because I do feel like it's very, very important. So this webinar was on aggression and how to work collaboratively with individuals who might present with aggressive behaviors. But this disclaimer I thought was just incredibly important. So we by no means whatsoever want to equate FASD and aggressive behavior. These terms are in no way synonymous. Folks with and navigating FASD are not inherently aggressive. So I want to touch on that, and I want to talk about there's going to be a lot of sharing of the various presentations of FASD, some of the symptoms, the traits, and as I mentioned, the comorbidities. But this does not mean that because I share, say, a statistic where folks with FASD are kind of overrepresented in those statistics, it does not mean that they for sure have aggression or they for sure struggle in school or have a learning disability. So FASD is very unique, it's very complex. And so it's just important to keep that in mind, right? I also consider this is something that I've experienced like with my own children as well, that the more that we're often attending webinars on, say, aggression or disruptive behaviors. And unfortunately, that kind of informs, it can start to form perhaps like a bias around what we believe FASD looks like. So it's just important to keep this in mind so that we're not always considering FASD and relating it to aggressive behaviors or some of the negative behaviors that we might see. Okay, so FASD stands for Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder. It is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disabilities in Canada. This is one of the slides that when I share in the schools, I think shocks a lot of the educators, just that there is right now, so in my slides, it'll say the 4% of people in Canada are affected by FASD. When I'm reading more of the newer research that is emerging, it's starting to trend more to the 5%. And that is, it is very likely a higher percentage. We know that it does go underreported as well. So typically when I'm sharing this information, I relate it to this means about one student in every classroom may have FASD. So if you consider it, if you were to apply that to different settings, so such as your workplace, considering that statistic, social events, family events, just that FASD is a lot more common than what many do believe. So as I mentioned, it is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disabilities, and this one also, I get a lot of looks during the presentation, just that this is not something that they have heard before, more so in the schools, that FASD is more common than autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and Tourette syndrome, all combined. I think we know that it is prevalent, and we're hearing more about it, especially as the research emerges. Just, however, knowing or learning that it's more common than all of the various disabilities up here combined, I think that just is a little bit shocking when we consider that we more often, especially in the school setting, hear more about, say, autism spectrum disorder. So that is just a little bit shocking, a little eye-opening. And you're watching me regulate in real time. There we go. Okay, so as I mentioned previously, there are a host of comorbidities, which is the presence of 2 or more health conditions. And so there are over 428 possible comorbid conditions that co-occur in people with FASD. It is also estimated that 90% of people with FASD experience at least one mental health challenge in addition to FASD. Some of the common co-occurring conditions are ADHD, learning disorders, mood disorders like depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, and possibility of psychotic disorders as well. So again, keeping in mind that unfortunately, like when I read that out, that just seems like a lot of perhaps negative information. So we want to go back, and just because this is important information to consider, we don't just want to group an individual or assume that an individual with FASD may have a psychotic disorder, or, you know, we don't want to further stigmatize an individual. So. Corey, I might have needed that clicker. There we go. The problem is I have to, from here, see where my little mouse hits on the little button over there. Okay, so along with the co-occurring mental health conditions, FASD is a whole body disorder, and some health problems are 100% more likely in those with FASD compared to the general population. This is something that when I was first learning about FASD and how it presents was fairly shocking to myself. So some of these could include nervous or certain problems with the nervous system, your senses, hearing and vision difficulties, dental issues, and other congenital conditions and chromosomal differences. So the frequency of hearing loss, when I looked into this a little bit further, and so the frequency of hearing loss was estimated to be up to 120 times higher than the general US population. So that is a US statistic. Blindness and low vision were 31 and 71 times higher respectively. So that is, when we consider just, again, I usually share a lot of this information across the school setting, but if we keep in mind that when we're working with kids and youth in schools and we think about some of the issues that come up with language and the receptive language domain that individuals with FASD experience, it could be perhaps like a missed hearing loss diagnosis, right? It's just sometimes we're not considering that the fact that FASD is a whole body disorder. It isn't just some of those mental health comorbidities. I do share information on Miles Himmelrich. So if you have attended any of the conventions for FASD, if you have honestly, if you've looked at I think it's Pop FASD, Can FASD. He does a lot of speaking for those, and he does share that he struggles with arthritis, and something that he has lived with, I do believe he's mentioned, since his teen years. So a lot of these health conditions too, they start a little bit earlier, or can start a little bit earlier in life. So I did find this interesting that most recently I attended a school, and I was speaking with the main teacher of this one little guy, and I have permission to share the story without names and all that jazz. And so one of the issues that they were seeing, and it was more of a safety concern around this little guy, and he's just the sweetest little muffin, they always are, was that he just had this urge to take food, just to like if it was out, it was his. And the school had put in a lot of strategies around how to keep him away from the food, but the problem is that this little guy suffers with celiac disease, and so it didn't matter if it was a muffin, if it was anything, a granola bar. It just he saw it and he wanted it, and the school did report that caregivers had shared that there was previous, like a food insecurity. So a little bit, it does come from traumatic experiences. However, when we keep in mind, if I had celiac disease, or if you yourself consider if you had celiac disease, and then you treat yourself to a muffin or anything, it's highly likely that you're not going to do that again, given the natural negative consequence. However, this little guy, it didn't matter. If he wanted it, he was going to take it. And I find this interesting because for the first 10 or 15 minutes that I was speaking to this educator, I could have sworn that we were talking about a little guy from another school who perhaps had moved to this school. And so I had to stop her and I'd say, is this a new student? And she said, no, we've known him since kindergarten. We've had all these strategies in place and we're really trying, but sometimes, he just he finds a muffin and he wants it. If you give a mouse a cookie, they're going to want another one, that kind of thing. And no, it was completely two separate individuals that with the same experience around food, around wanting to just seeing it and grabbing it and not being able to not act on that impulse, right? Even though despite the negative consequence. The first little boy had celiac disease. I do believe the second little one had Crohn's. So very similar and very similar natural negative consequence that would happen, but both just, it didn't matter. It didn't matter that the negative consequence was fairly severe. They couldn't not act on the impulse. I saw a question.
I was just going to say, I'm a parent of 3 children with FASD, and that is absolutely common. Anything to do with the other pieces, they don't know when they're full because feelings and sensations that they have often, they don't go off like they do for you or I. And so they also often don't feel pain the same way you or I do. And so some of the negative consequences that you think they're getting, they may not be getting those negative consequences like you or I might, because I know my kids, like my one son, when he broke his arm, and we took him to the doctor, and he was broken pretty good, and the doctor was pulling at it, and he was like looking up at the ceiling. The doctor didn't even want to do an x-ray, and I forced him to. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that the pain sensitivity is different because their nerve development is different, and so just really important to know with those guys that they sometimes it can present as a negative consequence, but may not be because they may not have the tummy pain that other people experience. They may not feel that. So that could be a piece of it as well.
No, for sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is a huge piece of it. That what we might view as an obvious, negative consequence that well, you won't do that again. It likely does not make, they may not make that connection, right? And it's with not their fault that they are not. So. All right, getting the hang of it. Okay, this idea, so as I mentioned, FASD is unique and complex. Just because you have met one individual with FASD does not mean that you know the experience of all, essentially. And so I like to share this visual. Specifically, this is something that I have used for my son with autism and explaining to individuals or even professionals. And why I like it is if you were to imagine that every single dial on, I won't lie to you, I do not know if this is called a soundboard, so if anybody, okay, thank you so much. Oh, thank you, yes. So I didn't know the technical term, so I figured somebody would help me, and I appreciate it. So if you were to look at all of these little dials and imagine that each dial is a different expression of, or a different symptom, a different varying level of like a capacity. That is, I really find that this is a helpful visual because one thing that I like to, not necessarily, I guess challenge is one word for it, is when we hear high functioning versus low functioning. And I know sometimes that's maybe just the quickest way to explain the average life for the individual we may be talking about. I challenge that because when we really think about high functioning versus low functioning, I think what we're really talking about is the impact that their behaviors or traits or struggles impact our daily lives, right? And so I consider in my work previously, I worked as a respite worker, and I worked with a little girl who had Rett syndrome. And so she was nonverbal. And oftentimes people would describe her as low functioning. And that is definitely not the case. And I think when we place somebody in a box like that, then we kind of start to work from a bias about what they're capable of. And when I tell you that this little girl was the sassiest individual I think I've ever met, just a look, and how it would typically go is typically her dad would crack a joke, right, at my expense, but all good things, very funny. And you would just see her, and she would just kind of smile and give this look. And you just knew that she was kind of razzing you. And that higher order thinking of the sarcasm that would come out whenever one of us would make a sarcastic joke, or so I like to share this visual because I do think if we were to consider many individuals just within this spectrum, it helps with having just a greater understanding and a little bit more empathy about where they're coming to each daily life, each task, that kind of thing. Okay, so keeping in mind the previous slide and the sounding board, the primary disabilities that are associated with FASD are also known as like the 10 brain domains. And alcohol use during pregnancy can damage the structure of any part of the brain, and the functional impairment can be classified within these 10 neurodevelopmental domains. Typically, so the diagnosis of FASD requires severe impairment in at least 3 of domains. When you consider, and when you take a look at these, so we have motor skills, brain structure and functioning, cognition, language, academic achievement, memory, attention, executive functioning, affect regulation, and adaptive behavior or social skills. It's hard to choose which ones that to kind of touch more on, as I only have 45 minutes and I do have the gift of gab sometimes. So, but also when I look at them, and even so when a school asks me to, we have time for maybe 5 of those, which ones would you choose? Well, it's hard to choose because a lot of those play into each other, right? If we look at academic achievement, well, that could be based on memory, language, motor skills, all of those, right? They all kind of intertwine together. So it's hard to pull each one apart from the other or to isolate them. But I did, 2 of them. So when it comes to the brain domain of language, so we have our receptive, our expressive, and pragmatic. So receptive is our ability to understand language, whether it be written, whether it be verbal, and then we have our expressive language, so our ability to communicate our thoughts and feelings through words, gestures, signs, and or symbols. And then pragmatic, so our social language skills, taking turns, picking up on those social cues, that kind of thing. And so one of a trend that we've seen in the diagnostic clinic in Lethbridge had shared with me that a trend that they see is that many individuals that come through the clinic have have more of a delay in their receptive language, but have very well developed expressive language skills. So what that can look like, though, is an individual who can recite word for word, say the rules that you've given them, but do they understand the rules that you've given them? They're able to talk about them, and I'm very much guilty of this when I talk with my kids, Jackson, what did I just say? Or can you tell me what I said to you? And sometimes they'll repeat back and I have to be like, okay, that's not an FASD informed support. I should switch it up. So if I'm wanting to share or teach them a rule, one of the best strategies to do so is specifically to have them in the setting that the rule applies to, right? So another example of this would be a school that I had attended. What they found was one of the young kids, and this was something that a previous coach had worked on, but it was a story that they shared, that he had been told the rules of the lunchroom over and over and over again, but then he still, when he was suspended, he still continued to not follow the rules. And so what they figured out was that he could recite the rules, he had memorized them, it took him time, but it's that he wasn't taught them in the setting. And so when they took him to the lunchroom and they walked step by step, you know, the expectations, where he needed to sit, if he needed something warmed up, he needed to wait, all the little details, but they walked him through it in the specific setting, they found that he was able to retain the information instead of, say, just listing the rules. This was a time where he needed to also hear the rules, as well as have them listed too. So it is also common for individuals with FASD when it comes to the social language skills, so the pragmatic, to just struggle with picking up on social cues, but also to understand what somebody means, like if there is a hidden meaning or an underlying meaning. So some sarcasm wouldn't be great, may not be understood, but other times they might be a master at it, right? So keeping in mind when you're working with individuals with FASD, if you were to say, okay, go clean your room, or go write a resume, those may be tasks that they may need broken down. They may need a buddy to work with them, depending, to help them get started, considering that the attention can sometimes be impacted. They might need somebody just to help with that starting off process. So when you are trying to get through to an individual or communicate something important, it's important to speak face-to-face. We say keep it short and sweet, and choose, this is definitely a strategy more so in schools, but choose an area in the room where there's minimal distractions behind you as well. Because oftentimes if there's something more interesting than you, that's what they're gonna look at. So it is also common for individuals with FASD to be referred to as, I'm used to saying it as 10-second kids in a 1-second world. And so one of the most helpful strategies that I have found that I've shared is when asking children and youth a question, but even individuals, adults as well, give them time to process. So example of this could be, you know, very simple. What do you want to eat for dinner tonight? Do you want takeout? Do you want meatloaf? Do you want spaghetti? What they say is, what we need to do is preface the question like, hey, Corey, I'm going to ask you what you would like for supper tonight. I don't want you to tell me right away. I want you to think on it, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about it. And it just allows that time for them to process. And if you can also write it down, so visuals are a very helpful strategy for individuals. So it's not just visuals such as like a schedule as all, that's helpful, but also if what you're communicating can also be written down, then they have a reference to that question or the content of the question as well. One thing I keep in mind, and I do share this, I've started a running list as one thing that I find that I struggle with is it would fit within that receptive language domain, but is, and I'm sure many people can relate to this, when somebody's asked you a question or somebody said something to you and before you even really have time to process, you go, sorry, what? But then by the time you've said, sorry, what? You heard it's like you just needed that extra couple seconds to take in the information and you know what they said. So I've started a list in my phone that I've added to one of my other presentations about where this has happened, specifically with my husband. This happens a lot, and it definitely contributes to a what were you saying situation. this weekend we were in Lethbridge for a convention, and we were driving past Henderson Park, and I was not paying attention. And what I thought I heard Jeff say was, oh, pandas in the park. But no, he said, oh, Henderson Park. And so then spurred a conversation where I just started talking to him about pandas. Like, oh, I think like Calgary Zoo's going to get pandas. And I think Jeff was driving like, what? Like, would you, right? And the amount of times that it happens is absolutely ridiculous. And then it all makes sense after, because Jeff was just, where did that come from, right? So like I said, the house is very interesting. But that can be something that commonly happens with kids, children, youth, adults with FASD, is just they may require that extra time to process the information, especially if it is verbal. Other times I did have and this is what I mean by FASD is very unique. Everybody is so individual, and how it impacts them is just very, very individual. So another school had shared with me, they were given permission for me to look over the clinic results from the diagnosis, which was incredibly helpful because it kind of provided me a little bit of a roadmap of what to expect, and perhaps strategies that I could share. And so one of the specific things that it had mentioned was that with this young little guy, if you were to give him a paragraph to read, that's where he struggled. He wasn't able to retain the information and then share it back. However, if somebody verbally read it out to him, even without the paragraph in front of him, it was completely different. And so I find that interesting, and it was very impressive to me, because if you were to just list me, especially like directions, that happens so commonly, you turn left, you turn right, and on this street, and then it's gone. For me, I need it. The Google Maps is my best friend because it has the concrete information right there. I don't know if anybody else can relate to that. Hopefully. Okay, and the other brain domain that I chose was memory, and it all comes together in a little bit here. But so when we think about memory and retaining information, there is a gigantic process. So we have our sensory input, but our sensory memory. And our sensory memory lasts about maybe a second, if that. And that's that we're taking in the smells, the sights, the sounds, that kind of thing. And then we have the short-term memory and then long-term memory. And they say anything that you retain after, I believe it is 30 seconds, perhaps, I do believe it's 30 seconds, would fit into that longer-term memory. And that's where we're hoping that it's going to be stored so that it can be recalled later on. So when we think about recalling information, when we think about the information being stored into long-term memory, it's the process of encoding. And so encoding happens at the short-term as well as long-term. But that is where there needs to be that process. If you see where it's the filtering mechanism, right? That's where we filter, okay, do I need to keep this in the short term? So maybe that's the next 30 minutes, or do I need to store this later on so that I can remember a month from now? And oftentimes we can see a deficit in the encoding, the storage, which then would obviously have an impact on the recall. And when you think about, say, like long-term memory, those are the information that you would pull from, say, like you would need for like working memory, so your executive functioning. So what do I need to do in order to write a paper? What do I need to do in order to work on time? That kind of thing. So when we see delays in the encoding or the storage and then the recall of information, that's where we see more of those secondary, say, disabilities that individuals with FASD may experience. So struggling with keeping a job because they may not be able to get to work on time, or they may not complete tasks on time for their job. Further, when we think about memory and language and how those work together, so the sensory input, individuals with FASD can often struggle with too much sensory input or not enough sensory input. So that is going to also affect whether or not we're retaining or we're hearing the information, right? So language and memory really go hand in hand when it comes to some of the more, I would say, secondary disabilities that come or that we may often see with FASD.
If I could just say something.
Yes.
I remember I was talking to Miles Fulbright at one of the conventions at Blue Ridge, and he told me that when he was younger, sometimes when he had a job, he could be trained on how to do a specific task and do it really well, but then the next day he completely forget what he had to do. So he had to relearn it every single day. So it was really hard for him to go through certain processes at certain jobs because it was like every single day he had to figure out how to do it again, every single day. So and that's, when you're thinking of perspective for an educator, right?
Yeah.
Teach it every day, and that's sometimes a big part of it, right? So
Yeah. No, thank you for that. That is a huge part of it. Just the fact that an individual may learn something and they may have it, they may feel confident with it, and you see that confidence with the individual, but unfortunately, it may be lost in a week's time. It may have been replaced by some other important information that they needed to hold, right? So I actually had a statistic that was very relatable. So yeah, when you think about memory, and this is, I think we all can relate to this in a sense. So research actually has found that approximately 56% of information is forgotten within an hour, and 66% of information after a day, and 75% after 6 days. So I do think a lot of times we can relate to individuals who may experience the delay in that recall of information as well. And like I said, when it comes to depending on what's going on around us, right? If we're in a state of dysregulation, we are definitely more likely to not recall the important information. Think about when you come to the top of the hill by Swirls and it's that four-way stop, but you all four vehicles hit the four-way stop at the same time. I feel like that's when we all kind of go like, oh, what are the rules of a four-way stop again, right? So it can be very, very relatable. So the reason that I chose memory and language is that when I look into the research and a few of the books that I'm reading around FASD is that deficits in memory and language may trick us into believing that an individual is lying. This is a common negative behavior that is spoken about that I come in to help share strategies around. And so this one is one that I like to talk about because it just shares a little bit more perspective and gives another insight. So what could be happening, the child, youth, or adult may not remember whether an event really happened or whether it was a dream or something they simply thought about. If you think about that, all of the processes that going into encoding a memory, sometimes we get a little bit confused about what really happened, the details. I don't know about anybody else, but I do know I specifically had shared a story with my parents about it was an interesting but could be realistic experience. And I do know my parents, that didn't happen. That was definitely a dream, right? So I don't know if anybody can relate to that, but sometimes our memory, oftentimes it will fill in gaps because we don't remember every situation perfectly. And so something to keep in mind is that they may not be lying. It could be more of an omission that they're not aware about, or they could be just struggling to communicate the story of what happened effectively. So I do usually tell a story, and Jeff loves this story. He doesn't, that's definitely sarcastic. But I share that I had to explain this concept to Jeff with our daughter in that we had a situation where I heard Kimmy just hollering. And so she's my little one with intermittent explosive disorder, which really means she's got big feelings. So you hear Kimmy when she's mad. You also hear her when she's happy. But I hear her just hollering, and I come in there and she's crying, and Jeff's in there in the room with her. And so is our son, who's definitely not helping the situation either. And Kimmy's like, "Dad hit me." And I go, "What?" And this is why Jeff absolutely loves this story. But, and disclaimer, Jeff did not hit Kimmy. But in that moment of dysregulation, she's hurt, and she's an 8, right? That was the easiest way to communicate what had happened. And so what had happened was Jeff had entered Kimmy's room, and he was carrying a laundry basket, and Kimmy's quite squirrely, so she's jumping and Jeff's moving, and he happened to just bump her with the laundry basket, which actually made her, I think she was on the bed, like I said, hyperactive. She's doing some wild things. But then there's Jeff, right? And he's very intense. Like, I did not hit her. And that just reminded me of like when you're being misunderstood and you're adamant, but unfortunately it kind of almost makes you look guilty when you're just like, I didn't do this, or I misunderstood, right? And we got to the bottom of it, and I explained to Jeff that at that time, that's just the language that Kimmy had to explain what had happened. And so essentially that's just kind of an example of the not somewhat of a delay in communicating, right? And how I talked about when we're dysregulated, we're not always communicating effectively. But yes, disclaimer, Jeff did not hit Kimmy, just so you know. He make sure I put that in there. Further, something that happens is can be confabulation. So something, or this is often experienced for individuals who have an impairment or with deficits in the frontal lobe of the brain. And so we also, many of us don't know this. We all actually experience a degree of this, that our brains will fill in missing information, and you never know when your brain is filling in missing information. So this is why these are my 2 favorite to share. There we go. So if you've ever heard of the Mandela effect, so it refers to a situation in which a large mass of people believe that an event occurred when it did not. And it was originated in 2009 by Fiona Broome, after she discovered that she, along with a number of others, believed that Nelson Mandela had died in the 1980s, and he did not. He actually had passed away in 2013. And so I don't know if anybody knows about this one, but Britney Spears did not wear a microphone in the Oops, I Did It Again music video. I don't know if anybody's mind is blown right now, but I'm a millennial, so this one was like, what? It did, thank you, Myrna. But it did further explain that, I think, so sometimes our brain can take information from other places and kind of mistakenly store it with other information, kind of filling in these gaps. So the reason you might think this is that the Britney Spears Barbie doll was sold with the microphone. So just for all of you Britney fans out there. And further, the Monopoly man did not have a monocle. Is this shocking to anybody? Like, okay, I'm seeing nodding, thank you very much. This one was shocking to me, and they do get progressively more like, what? Like mind-blowing. So again, this, as some suggest, might have a simple confusion between him and the Planters Peanut Company mascot. So an example of our brain filling in information. This one got me. It used to have a cornucopia behind the fruit, right? It never did. So again, another common example of our brain filling in the misinformation. Is this one shocking to anybody? Or like a little surprising? Okay.
I thought there was somebody who went through like a thrift store and actually found it with the cornucopia behind.
I really tried to look, because I knew if I like presented this and somebody was like, nope, I can debunk that. And I didn't find it, but I still believe that there was one there, because I remember it. This is in my memory. So I feel very strongly on this. Okay, This one might hit millennials again. So though many of us clearly remember black detailing on the Pokemon character's tail, it is just yellow. I presented these photos to a group of EAs at the beginning of the month, and this one was one where I had people, actually had somebody text their son, I do believe, to be like, no, check your card, again, I don't believe this one, but apparently never had the black. So the next one is a little bit more controversial, depending on if you're a Star Wars fan or not, which my husband very much is. C-3PO is not all gold. He has one silver piece on his right leg. Is that shocking to anybody? Jeff was unwilling to accept that information because, and when I say Star Wars fan, like he has the big Millennium Falcon Lego set, so like he is, do you have a Star Wars water bottle? Yes. Is this shocking?
Yes.
Okay. To be honest, I never really noticed his leg. I don't watch Star Wars all that much, unfortunately. So, yeah, but that one, like Jeff was not willing to accept it. But if you look it up, absolutely. He has a silver leg. So when I was putting together the presentation, one thing that I really wanted to include was the working group, the adult group, so the change makers. And if you have attended one of the conferences, listening to these individuals speak is just amazing. Like the way that they so eloquently share their struggles, their strengths, just all the things is just amazing. I went to my first conference, thank you, Myrna, and it was the greatest time. It just filled my cup right up. So I needed to include them in the presentation because also their mantra is nothing about us without us. And I think that that's very important when we're talking about how to support individuals. We also should be hearing from them themselves, as well as their caregivers, like those who are just like doing life with them, supporting them. So these individuals on the screen are known as the Adult Leadership Committee on FASD, and they recently published a research article that goes more into depth about the specific struggles as it relates to the ACE childhood studies, so the adverse childhood experiences. And what kind of sets their research study apart is that they look at ACEs across the lifespan. And so they did a huge anonymous survey, and they had just amazing results that gave such a great picture into just the complexities that some individuals with FASD experience. And the average age of the individual answering the questionnaire was 30. So these were struggles that they are currently working through, as well as strengths. And so Miles, which Corey had spoke about too, so he's in the middle picture there, or in the top picture. And so he often shares, one of his talks that I love to share information from is that it's titled More Than a Label. And so Miles is an international speaker. He's a husband, a father. He is diagnosed with FASD, and he speaks about the importance of being more than a label of FASD. He's not just his diagnosis. He talks about the impact of hearing negative labels throughout his lifetime and how that's had on him. Some of those include special needs, lazy, not trying, inattentive, you have no follow through. And he just talks about challenging that narrative and more so focusing on the strengths of individuals. So in that research study, they also talk about the protective factors. And so one of the protective factors includes having individuals, service providers that really support, but that understand FASD and how complex it is. And so I really found that to be lovely to share, that those of us in the room too, we could be considered a protective factor for the people that we work with and that we get to serve. Further, when we think about those negative labels, it got me thinking about the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy. My goodness. So people often form expectations about others, which then guide their interactions with those individuals. In turn, these interactions can lead the individuals to behave in ways that confirm the initial expectations. This phenomenon is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one thing that I one that I relate to for this is that I remember when my mom, a few years ago, she was finishing her master's degree with a friend in education. And her friend had asked if she could interview me for her thesis. And I thought it was a little bit out there, a little weird. I wasn't too sure. And so the reason why she was interviewing me is that she was doing her master's thesis on grade retention. And so grade retention is when you hold a student back in a certain grade, whichever grade. And I was held back in grade 2. And so I was very, very surprised to learn of all the negative impacts that holding me back in grade 2 was supposed to have on me, that I should have been overrepresented in the justice system, that I could experience many struggles around, say, addiction, and just a lot of these negative assumptions, right? And so this was the first I'd heard it, and it just kind of got me thinking about the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and how maybe if that information had been told to me over and over, if I had seen it commonly, what that impact would have had on me, because I can tell you that I have never been arrested, so I have a clean criminal record. But I find it interesting that the research back then very much kind of steered professionals, but also caregivers, away from something that could be a helpful support to somebody such as myself. Further, there was a famous study that kind of outlined the self-fulfilling prophecy, and what they did was they conducted an experiment to see whether student achievement could be self-fulfilling based on the expectations of their teachers. So what they did was they gave elementary school children an IQ test and then informed their teachers which children were going to be average and which children were going to be the bloomers. And so the bloomers were the 20% of students who showed unusual potential for intellectual growth. And typically what happened was, in the bloomers, they would get a little bit more, they found that the educators would give more detailed feedback. They'd spend a little bit more time. And what they found was that the results, when they tested them again for IQ, is that the experimental group, so the bloomers, the randomized one, their test results were significantly higher than the average students. And even though the academic bloomers were chosen at complete random. And so the bloomers gained an average of 2 IQ points in verbal ability, 7 points in reasoning, and 4 points in overall IQ. And so that just kind of takes me back to the disclaimer that I had shared in the beginning, right? That it's important to know some of the behaviors and some of the ways that FASD may manifest. But we shouldn't get stuck there, right? That's where we need to take more of a strengths perspective. And it's important to look at the ways that FASD can present in order to inform ourselves, but just to not get stuck in the negative connotations. And further, this is one of my favorite quotes to share too. So your explanation guides your intervention. And so when we interpret some of the issues or the problems that may arise with the people that we work with as intentional, or they're non-compliant, then typically that's how we're going to respond. And so we owe it to the kids, the youth, the adults that we are serving to be more intentional about how we see them, we understand them, and that we come to know them, and how we connect with them. And so this is a direct quote from the research study that the adult team had done. It says, while negative experiences for people with FASD are common, the value of protective factors should not be lost. These include early diagnosis and support, stable caregivers, as well as educational, mental health, and physical health systems that understand the nature of FASD and what is needed for a person to successfully face life's challenges. And so, as I said previously, I really do think that it's beautiful that we as supporters have the potential to be that protective factor for the individuals that we're supporting as caregivers. But that is what I wanted to base the presentation around, is that we do have the ability to influence in a positive way. So as long as we are connecting and getting to know the individual and understanding their complexities. And that is all. Thank you so much. So thank you for engaging in the presentation and being open to the information. And thank you so much for those who added insights. I very much appreciate it. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them, as well as if you are interested in any of the research or any of the content that I shared, please feel free to email me and I would be happy to share any of the tidbits of information or expand on those as well. So, thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yes.
Talk about the program, do you work specifically with educators and children, or do you find it like that?
Yeah, so in the program my role is to support the educators specifically. I would say it still does help support the students. So what I can do is show, if I was to share like a strategy, I can model the strategy. That's part of kind of that, what I would say, the brainstorming process to see if it could work for that child or for the classroom as a whole. So typically I do more of working one-to-one with educators, but there still is a capacity to also support the student as well. So
is it ongoing support, or is it just like you go meet with them, it's one and done, or do they continue to access you like that?
it is, so it's ongoing support. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for the questions. Yeah, so it is ongoing support. I will come back as often as they'd like me, as I'm happy to travel wherever between Crow's Nest Pass and Oyen. I will stay away from the back roads, but yeah, it is ongoing support as much as they'd like to have me. And what I really love about the program, the child or the youth does not have to be diagnosed. It could be suspected. So that kind of takes down that barrier. As I shared in there, it's definitely beneficial to have the diagnosis for earlier intervention. But yeah, I am able to connect with them as much as they want. And I do love that I'm able to tailor to depending on the needs of the classroom or the district or the school. So
Does the school get a hold of you, or could we use you or bring you into a situation if we had clients who had children?
Totally. So what we like to do is it's definitely important for the school to reach out to me, but other service providers, I do have a few in the room actually who, Samantha from Bridges actually, just thanks for waving, and Danielle, they have introduced me via email to specific educators that could use the support or who have stated that they'd like the support of the program. So yeah, you can definitely share my information with them or CC me on an email, and then I can kind of take over and introduce myself in the program. So yeah. Okay. Thank you guys.